Well, yeah. I mean, they were popular. They were passed around. The epistles, which later get collected as the majority of the New Testament, and the majority of them may have been totally forged. Yet, scholars don't even like to use the F word. Bart Ehrman's not scared of that, but he's not the only one out there talking about forgeries. We'll get to more of those coming up next on Coast to Coast. So, and I want to take a moment here because I know the phones are already hot, Bart. I'm already seeing them ringing like crazy, and I know that a lot of people want to get in on this conversation coming up next hour is when we'll take some calls. That part of what you say in the book, Forged, your new book that's out, is that just because something isn't factual doesn't mean it doesn't contain truth.
Well, that's right. So, what I'm talking about in the book has to do only with whether an author is telling the truth about who he is. And so is the person writing this letter really Peter when he claims to be Peter? That's a different question from whether what he writes about, say, God or the human condition or the world, whether he writes about that is true or not. I mean, he could be right. He could say something that's actually true, even though he's lying about himself. And so my concern in this book is simply with the claim of the author about his identity. Is he telling us the truth or not? And that's the truth claims of the book otherwise have to be judged on some other criteria. Well,
to me, I mean, I've been aware of these things for a very long time and very interested in the subject, but they don't shake my faith like it shook yours. I mean, you went from being a hardcore conservative evangelical believer to agnostic in a few jumps.
Well, there were some jumps, and I think what this kind of knowledge, I think, shows is that if you accept what historians are saying about the Bible, it's very hard to be a fundamentalist. You can't really think that the Bible is without any errors in it or that there are any problems with the Bible because the Bible is filled with problems. And so for me, the first jump was away from being a fundamentalist Christian to becoming a more open-minded and I guess you would say a liberal Christian, and I was that for many years. This kind of information is not what led me to become an agnostic at all, because I think it's irrelevant to the question about whether God exists. I mean, if somebody claimed to be Peter and wrote a book, I mean, it has no relevance to the question of whether God exists or not. My agnosticism came about because of my wrestling with the problem of why there's suffering in the world.
Sure.
Which is unrelated to this question.
Except to say, and I appreciate the difference you're drawing on that, except to say, though, that we also get into a case where a lot of people do, where they say if anything in the Bible is false, then it's all false. And so there was a connection to, going from believing that it had to be sort of this ironclad thing. It's either ironclad or it's garbage. I mean, it's sort of in that extreme sense of nuancing in Scripture. And I think that for a lot of people, that sets them down the road that if you can prove one thing false in the Bible, then they completely lose their faith on that basis alone. For a lot of people, that's the paradigm.
That's right, and I think that's just a remnant of fundamentalism. It's a way of kind of turning fundamentalism inside out. That it's all one way or the other. It's all completely false or it's all completely true. Well, I don't think the world works like that. The world is filled with a lot of things in between, and you can't simply say it's all true or false. And one of the things I try to insist in my book is that you don't have to absolutely give up your faith in God if you agree with this idea that there are forgeries in the Bible. I mean, my closest friends are all people who are scholars of the Bible. I mean, that's the group I run around with. Most of them, in fact, are believing Christians, and most of them agree with just about everything that I say in this book. So this doesn't necessarily lead to a loss of faith.
Right. You count me in that group, although when you say you run around with a bunch of biblical scholars, really? Is there a lot of running around? Do you really do a lot of fun things together?
Well, yeah, these are not fundamentalists. These are good drinking buddies.
Okay, all right. I just want to understand. Some people say running around, and I don't know. I've known a lot of biblical scholars. All right, so they do most of their running when they're in seminary. That's it
Right.
tends to end later on. All right,
Yeah.
but all right, now let me. I'll give you another example of this. I think it's very. I was hearkening back to this. And the importance of understanding what a forgery is and the impact. You look at something non-biblical like the Da Vinci Code, which is a very popular novel that was based on, at least in part, on the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was based in part, or I would say maybe even largely, on a forgery. And that being the so-called documents that were found in France that we know later on were forged by Pierre Plantard, this guy who even went to jail once for being a forger, an extreme right-wing pro-Nazi forger who was trying to create a false lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene in France, which would eventually have led to perhaps him, Pierre Plantard, being made the king of France. that there was this sort of tortured way of thinking that they created to try to bolster the claims for the return of the monarchy in France, but it would be a right-wing monarchy this time, and that was the claim, and it ends up being this hugely popularized notion. A lot of what they made up out of thin air ends up being the basis of the Da Vinci Code, which is still by a lot of people accepted as fact, told as fiction.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a scary thing that people learn about historical events, like like the Emperor Constantine and his impact on Christianity, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that they get their information from something like the Da Vinci Code, which is, as you say, it's the so-called research in it is based on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which itself is based on a forgery. So these are things that actually impact how people look at the world, and so the whole issue of forgery ends up being very significant.
And I think you think about the movie, the Da Vinci Code, which didn't do too well in the United States or the UK, did huge business in Asia. And it's a scary thought to me that is what a lot of people are using as their lens into Christianity is the Da Vinci Code, the movie, and they're looking at that, and that's how they look at the Vatican. They use that movie in Singapore and Thailand or whatever to inform their view of the Vatican.
Yeah, well, it's a scary thing. I tell my students that if they really want to know about the history of the Middle Ages, the way to do that is not to watch The Search for the Holy Grail, the Monty Python. And
right.
If you want to learn about the history of early Christianity, the best way to do it is not to read the Da Vinci Code. But that is. You're right. That's where a lot of people get their information, because, of course, it's a lot more interesting to read than it is to watch the movie than it is to read what historians who actually devote their lives to this kind of research actually have to say in their books, because historians tend not to be nearly as interesting as novelists.
And the same thing can be said of the so-called Protocols of Zion. These were forged documents that represented. Now we know were written by the early version of the KGB. They were propaganda that was out there to try to destabilize the support for the Jews, make it easier to have pogroms, make it easier eventually, maybe even to the Holocaust. And they were completely forged documents about supposedly the vast international Jewish conspiracy. And again, there's forgeries then that are accepted as truth from people that end up leading to other people's demise.
I think it's really important for people to use their heads when they are, when they're thinking about historical documents and historical events. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book on forgeries in the Bible is because I think people are so gullible that they need to train themselves to be more critical, because the failure to be more critical leads to all sorts of heinous problems, including the one you're pointing to now, the kinds of anti-Semitism that are still rampant in the world today. A lot of the anti-Semitism goes back to documents that are forged, and I think people need to be more critical when they're looking at history and looking at documents like this.
Well, and that's where, back to your book, we start to hear about especially documents that were forged around the crucifixion, the central event for Christians, and the claims that have been made both for and against Christ's experience on the cross, and how a lot of these were completely accepted as truth and amazing archaeological finds for years before they were dismissed as forgeries. And you give some interesting examples in the book.
Well, yeah, so, we do have, of course, we have the Gospels in the New Testament, which are anonymous, and I would not include them among forgeries, although, as I do point out in the book, they're falsely attributed to people who didn't actually write them, but the authors did make these claims. You get later writings which actually claim to be written by apostles that talk about the crucifixion, some really interesting stories that claim to be written by Peter. We have a Gospel of Peter, for example, and it's interesting that this Gospel of Peter, which was maybe 30 or 40 years after the New Testament Gospels, it's a forgery. It claims to be written by Peter. It wasn't written by Peter. It's even more anti-Jewish than anything you get in the New Testament. And so what happens is people, when they write forgeries, they adopt their own points of view, and they put forth their points of view in the name of someone else to get this point of view heard. And this is one of the reasons that anti-Judaism took off so much in early Christianity, is because people were forging documents claiming to be apostles and embodying their own personal anti-Jewish views.
And we it's hard to get in the mind of everybody who wrote against the Jews in the first century or the early second century, although some of it I've always heard attributed to the idea that it was considered like Judaism was dead. I mean, like after the temple was smashed, after the Romans brought the hammer down on Jerusalem, the thought was that this was the past. They were not the future. That Gentiles and the Roman Empire, that was the future. And so the evangelists were using Judaism to try to advance the validity of their claim in order to be more appealing to the Gentiles and the Romans.
Yeah, that's a point of view that is put out there a lot, and I personally think that it's just the opposite. That the reason that Christians are attacking Jews in all this anti-Jewish literature, some of which is forged, is precisely because Judaism was a threat to the early Christian church, and it was a living threat. And, I think that explains better why there's such animosity, is because Christians were in competition with Jews for converts and for respectability. And so in order to advance their own causes, they had to attack Jews and Judaism.
Well, it's a fair point you make. The interesting part is where, as in the Gospel of Peter, where how Pontius Pilate is portrayed as even more of a victim of this than we know he would have been. He was a very powerful man in real life, and they make him out to be like, this poor guy who got sucked into the middle of this dispute amongst the Jews.
That's right. So in the Gospel of Peter, in fact, Pilate is extremely innocent when it comes to Jesus' death. It's the Jews who are guilty. And we have later forgeries that are even more interesting. We have books that claim to be written by Pilate himself, letters claiming to be written by Pilate, in which Pilate writes to the Emperor Tiberius and says that he's done this awful thing. He's crucified the Son of God, and now the Jews made him do it, and he really wished he hadn't now. And in some of the later forged literature, Pilate actually converts to be a Christian. And so in some parts of the Christian church today, still, Pilate has been sanctified as a Christian saint.
I've never heard that before. Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, the logic is that Christians made Pilate more and more innocent, because if Pilate's innocent, who's guilty? Well, it's those damn Jews.
Right.
And so that's why the innocence of Pilate. But it's all based on these forgeries that came about in later centuries.
Well, then, and in many centuries after that, then the forgery of the death sentence of Jesus Christ as written by Pontius Pilate.
That's right. Yeah, I talk about some of these 19th century forgeries in the book, in which this is one of them, where you have an alleged discovery of the actual writ of Pilate condemning Jesus to death, which is just something that was made up many centuries later.
But a lot of people believed it at first. It was considered to be the archaeological find of the century.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's why I keep trying to push people to be more critical and not simply to accept something because they see it written down someplace. Just because it's written doesn't make it true.
Well, and let's go through the reasons why we know it could not possibly have been the death sentence of Jesus Christ as written by Pontius Pilate, because he wrote it in Hebrew, supposedly, which
yes.
would never, right? And
yes.
what are the other reasons why this could not possibly have been a valid document?
Well, there are all sorts of kind of funny things about it, including there's a whole list of witnesses who allegedly who had borne testimony to this death of to this document, and but some of them are names that didn't exist in the ancient world, for example, that are French names that in fact.
Right. Capet or something like that is in there.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So.
Wasn't even a Hebrew or a Roman or a Greek name.
Yeah.
Okay, and then but then you're not alone. I want to mention some of the other ones from the last chapter of the book. The crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness.
Yes.
This was another 19th century forgery?
Yeah. So this kind of thing seemed to show up a lot, where you'd have these kind of eyewitness reports, and so modern scholars have had no trouble exposing these things. This one thing, this crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness, is actually based on a kind of a novel that was written in the 19th century by a German scholar, and it was actually a novel, but then somebody later took it as a serious piece of writing, kind of like somebody taking the Da Vinci Code today and writing
right.
a history based on it, and so that's where this crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness comes from. Is somebody's forging something on the basis of this novel that was written in the 19th century.
And the same thing with the unknown life of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, this was actually a very popular book for a long time, and the reason I think it was popular is because it explains what people have long wondered. Where did Jesus get all his wisdom from? If he grew up in some little rural place in Galilee, how is it that he was so wise? And so people today still think, maybe Jesus traveled to India and he learned the wisdom of the Brahmins, and that's exactly what happens in this particular book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, is that Jesus allegedly, he goes off to Tibet and he learns from the Buddhists, and then he comes back for his public ministry. And so this was completely exposed as a forgery by scholars who were able to show that the person who claimed to discover this book was the guy who actually wrote it, and he made the whole thing up.
Right, but they had to go to India. So they had to go to the monasteries. They had to go find the places where he said he had been, to go talk to the abbots who said, nah, he was never here.
That's exactly right. So
because up until that point, he made a fortune. He was the Da Vinci Code writer of his day. He made a fortune on it.
He did, and because he didn't say this was fiction, he said this was fact, and he made a ton of money off of it until they found out that in fact he just made the whole thing up. It's still quoted. I think you could even say some people like Marcus Borg, who's a popular writer, still kind of maintains an interest in that belief that Jesus spent time with Buddhists. I didn't know that about Marcus Borg, but I think that there's almost zero chance that Jesus went off to India to study, or that he
I have his book Jesus and Buddha, and in which he compares the sayings of Jesus and compares the sayings of Buddha. And I think the thought was that somewhere there had to have been some sort of cross-pollinization that had taken place.
Okay.
But I don't know that he says he actually went to India. I'll have to go look it up here in just a second. Anyway,
Okay.
I've got the book on my shelf, and I'll go pull it up right now. We're talking about Forged, Bart Ehrman. That brings us to the Passover plot. And I tell you what we'll do. Let's give the numbers here coming up next. We'll start to get to a couple of calls by the end of this hour. The feeling I'm getting by looking at the phones is that they're crazy busy and everybody wants to get on it. So why don't we? Well, I'll give away part of this next half hour, and we'll start taking some calls early for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged, Writing in the Name of God: Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. It's hard for me to read the cover in the dark here. Sorry about that. I had to really hold it up to the faint light I have in my studio. And so we'll give you the numbers next, and we'll start working to the conversation the way on Coast to Coast. Well, just to be accurate, I went to go find my copy of Jesus and Buddha, the parallel sayings from Marcus Borg. I can't find any place here yet where he says that he believes that Jesus and Buddha, or that Jesus and even Buddhism might have interacted. But I hear that from so many other people that I've just sort of accepted it in my head. So my apologies if I've misspoken there. I know it came up recently in the chat room. We were doing a chat for the Coast Insiders, and somebody brought up did I believe that Jesus went to India and learned Christianity as he interpreted it, as he learned Judaism or wisdom as he interpreted it from Asia, from the Orient, and I said there's no evidence of that, but there are some interesting parallel sayings, and that does exist. But I did find something. I did grab the Da Vinci Code down off the shelf in the break there, and I want to share an opening page from Dan Brown's book as it pertains to the book by Bart D. Ehrman. Forged is his new book. We gave you the numbers. You can jump into the conversation next. Let's all be civil. Let's play in the sandbox nicely as we're talking about which books of the Bible are 100% complete forgeries, at least according to Bart Ehrman. Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. I want to talk about the Passover plot here in just a second, too, with Bart Ehrman. That gets a mention in the book Forged. Although the majority of the book is about the books that were and were not included in the Bible that were clearly forged, as you make the argument. It's just that scholars don't like to use that F word. I want to read you something from the beginning of the Da Vinci Code. Okay, Bart?
Okay.
Here's the first page. Under bold-face type, it says fact. This is before the story begins. Fact. The Priory of Sion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. In 1975, Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as Les Dossiers Secrets, identifying numerous members of the Priory of Sion, including Sir Isaac Newton, Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci. What he doesn't mention there is, yes, they did find them in Paris's National Library, but they were found by the people who planted them there, by the people who wrote them. The people that forged them were the ones that found them and said, "Look what we found." And even at the time that Dan Brown wrote this, it was a well-known forgery by this right-wing extremist guy. Pierre Plantard. He knew that they were forged. He never mentions the fact that they were forged documents, just that they were found documents. So
yeah, well, it's it's actually one of the ways people forge documents is they will sometimes they'll begin a forgery by indicating how the forgery was found. And so you make up a discovery narrative, and that verifies the truthfulness of it. And so Dan Brown is standing in a very long tradition of people who have either been fooled by this way of doing things or else who have used it themselves.
Or you make the case, too, about the forgeries that exist that whether or not they were included in the Bible that mention whatever you do, be on the lookout for forgeries. But we know it itself is a forgery.
Yes, that's right. So this is a ploy that's used there's a 4th century Christian forgery called the Apostolic Constitutions, which claims to be written by the apostles, even though it was written 300 years after they were dead. And this forgery in the name of the apostles warns its readers, don't read forgeries in the names of the apostles.
Right. Right. Pretty funny. All right, and then let's mention the Passover plot, because this book, which was never purporting to be a work of fact, still gets mentioned. I still get calls that talk about the theories of the Passover plot as though it were a serious scholarly treatise on what happened at the cross, or there was a documentary that was made on it, and people still talk about that like this was intended to be an expose of what really happened when Christ died.
Well, it supports the point of view that many people find attractive, especially people who really love conspiracy theory. If anyone who really likes conspiracy theory, the Passover plot's the book for them, because it argues that Jesus actually planned his own death, and when he was given the gall mixed with myrrh on the cross, it was actually a narcotic that was designed to make his vital signs slow down. So he actually didn't die on the cross. He survived crucifixion, and that he planned it himself so that he could appear to rise from the dead, and that it was all Jesus' own setup. And so when he allegedly was raised from the dead, it wasn't because he died, because he raised from the dead. It's because he never died in the first place.
And then he only goes on to live for 6 more months, according to the Passover.
Well, he wasn't planning on getting stuck in the side by the spear by this Roman soldier, and so that ended up killing him. That was one contingency that he wasn't able to plan for.
But he doesn't escape to France and have babies with Mary.
No, that's a whole different conspiracy theory.
Right. You know, it's interesting. I did hear, though, that the gall mixed with myrrh, which is given to Christ on the cross, that was intended to be a painkiller or hallucinogenic. There
are debates about what that's all about, but some people have thought that it was meant to be a kind of a painkiller. Although I don't think you can really kill that much pain.
Well, yeah, it's true. But I've always wondered, well, why doesn't somebody just mix some gall with some myrrh and see what happens?
Yeah, that's a good thing. I'm not sure they even know what it is.
These other Bible scholars you run around with, why not have a gall and myrrh night?
I think we'll stick to bourbon, but thanks.
Okay, all right. Well, we're talking with Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. And just to make the point again for people who may be coming in late, what you really, there's a lot of discussions about various books of the Bible, but you really focus on as the forgeries are the ones that make an actual claim to say, I am Paul and I wrote this book and here's the reason why you can trust me that it's really Paul, and then goes on to say things, and we know for a fact that was somebody making a false claim and forging a document.
That's right. I'm not talking about people making up stories or whether what they say is theologically right or wrong. I'm simply talking about an author who claims to be somebody other than who he really is. And this was done widely in the Roman world. It was done in the New Testament, and part of my argument is that in the ancient world they looked upon this as a deceitful practice. It was thought of as lying, and so when this happens in the New Testament, we should call it what it is, which is a deceitful lying practice, and our word for that today is forgery.
And we shouldn't be surprised. Look, even in the last 30, 40 years, remember the guy tried to forge the autobiography of Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes was still alive.
Yes, that's right. It happens all the time. And, when I first started thinking about this, it was when the Hitler diaries had come out.
Right.
And everybody was convinced that Hitler had kept these diaries through World War II. Well, they were an absolute forgery done in order to make money. So people still do forgery today. It's just that today it's a lot easier to catch people because we have more sophisticated tools of analysis. In the ancient world, it was a lot harder to catch somebody because they simply didn't have the kind of research tools that we have today.
Well, it's still amazing, and I of course, the Hitler Diaries is a good example. But at least even when the Hitler Diaries came out, Hitler was dead. What's still so striking to me was the guy attempting to, fake the autobiography of Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes was still alive.
Yes, I know. It's quite striking what some forgers will do. We have instances of that in the ancient world too, of people who famous authors who expose forgeries in their own name, and their reaction is much like a modern person's reaction would be. They simply didn't like it because you weren't supposed to be doing this sort of thing, which shows that in fact even in the ancient world this was looked upon as a deceitful practice.
And if we were to take out all of the books that were forged that are in the New Testament, how many books are we talking about in your estimation?
Well, so there are 27 books in the New Testament, and they all have names attached to them. All 27 have somebody's name attached to them. Some of these books were written by the people whose name they go under, but not very many. You have the 7 letters of Paul that are undisputed, and the book of Revelation was really written by somebody named John, but we don't know which John it was. So that's 8 books. The rest are either anonymous books that have been wrongly attributed to somebody, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Were not really written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And others of them are flat-out forgeries, which, in other words, books where an author claims to be someone other than who he is. And so I would include in that number the 6 disputed Pauline letters. The books of 1st and 2nd Peter were not really written by Peter. Jude wasn't written by Jude. James wasn't written by James. I give evidence for this in the book, by the way. I mean, I'm not just kind of claiming this. I show why scholars are pretty sure that these claims are right, that these people didn't really write these books. And so that's mainly what my book is about. So it turns out there are about 11 books in the New Testament that in which the author makes a false authorial claim.
I just am reminded when I had a professor named Shirley Guthrie. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was a great guy. And he told me the story once about how the men's room down the hallway at the seminary used to have signs up on the men's toilet stalls that said 1st and 2nd John. Yes. You've heard this?
We had that at Princeton Seminary, too.
And over the urinals, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter. I thought that,
John, right.
They're very funny. Well, I thought the urinals thing with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter, I thought was very funny. All right, so let's go to Scott in Utica, New York, on Coast to Coast for a question for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. Scott?
Yes, I was calling in regards to the Da Vinci Code and the Holy Grail and the bloodline.
Okay.
Okay, and the validity of that. And, Jesus was referred to as a rabbi. And I don't recall ever being questioned, as far as what we read in the New Testament. And the thing was...
I don't know what you mean by that. Well, I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, he was... a lot, his claims to be the Son of God, and everything was questioned. But as far as being a rabbi,
okay.
I don't recall that being, he was a rabbi.
Okay.
And he was referred to as that. Well, there was criteria to be a rabbi. I recall, you had to be 30 years of age, I believe, and have a son of 12 years of age.
I don't know about the son. I don't know if I've ever heard that. Certainly, it was expected that if you were a rabbi, you would be married. I mean, that part I've always heard that was the only criteria. Yeah, I've never heard the 30. I've never heard 30 years of age before, because the life expectancy wasn't that old in the the ancient world. Bart, do you have a thought on this?
The problem with knowing about rabbis in the 1st century is that all of our evidence comes from later centuries. So we have Jewish writings, in the Mishnah, the Talmud, which are centuries after the 1st century that do specify certain things about that give us some information about rabbis in those days, but we don't have reliable information about what it meant to be a rabbi in the 1st century. The term rabbi simply means my teacher. And so Jesus was a teacher, and what most historians think is that the office of rabbi, which had these particular qualifications, is a later development, and that you don't have that before the temple was destroyed in the 1st century.
Does that help?
fascinating. Well, given that if he was married, as you mentioned, possibly, that would attest to him having a family and hence a bloodline.
Yeah, but see, the problem is that we don't know that he was married, and you didn't have to be married in the first century to be a teacher. And so later on, maybe that was something that was required, but not in the days of Jesus.
Well, to Scott's point, there's a difference between requirement and expectation. And there was an expectation that you were going to be a family man, you're going to be part of the community. But was it a requirement where they would have said, "I'm sorry, you can't be a rabbi yet. You're not married. You don't have kids." That's the part that seems that's the dividing line. And for the people that say, "Well, the Da Vinci Code is legitimate because he would have had to have been married and had kids in order for him to be a rabbi," that's the part. It's just the difference between it would have been common for him to have done that, but it wouldn't have been a requirement. Not that we know of.
No, that's right, and we in fact do know of other rabbis, or other teachers of the first century, other Jewish teachers who were not married, and so it certainly was not a requirement.
Not like it is today, where you're not, if in the Orthodox seminaries to become an Orthodox priest, if you graduate without being married, you can never be married as a priest. So you have to be married before you graduate, or you can't be a married priest. You knew that, right?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that people take a tradition that is firmly entrenched today, and they assume that that's how it was back in the days of Jesus. And when you actually put it that way, of course it sounds ridiculous, but that is what people think. And so what ended up becoming traditional Judaism wasn't necessarily in force in the first century when Jesus was around.
Jeff is in Culver City, California, on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Jeff?
Yeah, hi, Ian and Mr. Bart Ehrman. Just very quickly, man, I just wanted to ask you guys, given all the current evil that's going on, like the Libyan crisis, problems in the Catholic Church, suicide bombers and all that, I just want to know if religion is becoming obsolete because, apparently nobody's respecting each other or God or, the prophets and messengers. So I just want to know your opinion, is religion becoming obsolete and irrelevant in the 21st century?
Based on Muammar Gaddafi, problems in the Vatican Church, and what was the third one?
That was like the suicide bombers and terrorists.
Suicide bombers.
Yeah, all that, yeah.
All right. Bart?
Well, it's an interesting thing that in some parts of the world, Christianity and religion in general is becoming obsolete. In parts of Western Europe and in England, the church seems to be dying. But in most of the world, religion seems to be thriving very much. And so, I think that not just Christianity, but Islam and other religions are thriving. And I think when there's so much pain and misery in the world is when religion tends to do even better. Most of the time when there's such massive suffering, people turn to religion as a source of guidance and help, rather than turning away from religion because it doesn't seem to make sense anymore.
Dave is in Los Angeles, first-time caller line on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. Dave?
Yeah, hi. Yeah,
hi.
Can you hear me?
We'd like to be able to, so speak up. Yep.
Okay. I have, I find it extremely appalling that, last week the Vatican came out and said that Jews didn't kill Jesus Christ. It is absolutely sickening because I have a lot of Jewish friends that have been talking about this for a long time, and I've been telling them, say, look, you guys have to file a massive class action lawsuit against the Roman Catholic Church for having demonized you for 2,000 years, okay? And killed, and like you guys just said, killed. I know.
Lots of different Christians have done it over the years, and a lot of cases too. Remember, the Vatican didn't do the killing; the kings or the royalty of the particular country did. So I'm just merely saying that just for a point of clarity. So what do you want to? How does this relate to Bart? What's the question for Bart?
Yeah, and so what I wanted to ask Bart, first of all, if he knows about a book called The Christ Conspiracy.
The Christ Conspiracy, Bart, do you know about that?
No, I haven't read that.
Real quickly, Dave, you got about 10 seconds on that. What is the book?
It's a girl named Akariah. She wrote this book, and in this book, she says there's a secret gospel of Mark where Jesus Christ is a pedophile.
Oh, well, then that we can talk about. You're talking about the secret gospel of Mark. We can get to then coming up. Still a highly disputed book, and it's not pedophile, by the way, but there is the assertion that Christ is gay, or at least has a intimate experience with a man, and we can get to that coming up with Forged. Bart Ehrman is the author of that, and we'll see. Actually, you might be surprised about that particular secret gospel, the so-called secret gospel of Mark. On the way, too, then we'll get to all of your questions about the biblical documents. I know there's a couple of people hanging on that want to make a claim for specific Bible books on why they should be included, even if they are forged. On the way on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett.